A teenage girl looks down and sees blood on her clothing. She is standing in a world without bathrooms, disposable pads, health classes, cycle tracking apps, or printed instructions. Perhaps she is inside a mud brick house beside a river. Perhaps she is gathering plants beyond a small farming settlement. Perhaps she lives in a community so old that no written record of it will ever exist. We cannot know her name, the language she spoke, or the expression that crossed her face. We cannot even assume that she was terrified. Someone may already have warned her that this would happen, but the physical problem was immediate. The bleeding had begun. Her clothing could stain. Her work still had to be done. And whatever solution she used would probably disappear so completely that thousands of years later, historians would struggle to prove it had ever existed. This was not a rare event hidden at the edge of history. First, menstruation has been experienced by an enormous share of the women who have ever lived. It happened inside royal households, farming villages, desert camps, crowded cities, mountain communities, and temporary shelters built by people constantly on the move. Yet ordinary history tells us far more about weapons, taxes, tombs, kings, and wars than it does about the moment a young woman first began to bleed. The silence is not evidence that ancient people ignored menstruation. It reflects the kind of evidence that survived and the kind of people who were allowed to create permanent records. Stone monuments endured. Private conversations did not. Metal tools remained in the ground. Washed pieces of cloth vanished. Medical theories written by elite men were copied for centuries. Practical instructions spoken quietly between women could disappear in a single generation. The biological event has a modern name: menarche, the first menstrual period. It occurs after a sequence of changes during puberty, when communication between the brain, hormones, ovaries, and uterus has developed enough to begin menstrual cycling. The uterus builds a blood-rich lining as part of the body's preparation for a possible pregnancy. When pregnancy does not occur, part of that lining is released. But menarche is not controlled by age alone. Genetics matter, nutrition matters. Health, physical activity, living conditions, and the amount of energy available to the body can also influence its timing. That means there was never one universal age at which an ancient girl had her first period. Different girls, even inside the same community, could begin at different times. Difficult living conditions may have delayed menarche for some populations, but turning that possibility into a single prehistoric age would create certainty where none exists. This matters because a popular version of the story begins with a completely unprepared child who believes she is dying. That may have happened to some girls. It still happens in places where menstrual education is absent. But it cannot be treated as the default experience of every woman in the ancient world. Menstruation was repetitive and visible within households. Older women had already lived through it. Mothers, sisters, aunts, grandmothers, midwives, servants, healers, and other women in the community possessed practical knowledge, even when that knowledge was never written down. A girl could have noticed stained cloth being washed, changes in sleeping arrangements, restrictions around food or ritual, or women temporarily withdrawing from certain activities. She might have received an explanation before her first bleeding, during it, or only after someone recognized what had happened. The exact words are lost, but total ignorance is not the only reasonable reconstruction. To understand how she managed the blood, we meet the central archaeological problem. The most practical materials available to ancient women were also among the least likely to survive. Linen, wool, leather, bark fiber, grass, moss, fur, and other plant or animal materials decay. They burn, rot, tear, are eaten by microorganisms, or are reused until nothing recognizable remains. Preservation can occur in unusually dry deserts, frozen ground, waterlogged sites, or sealed tombs, but those environments are exceptional. Even when a fragment survives, identifying its purpose can be nearly impossible. A strip of fabric might have wrapped a wound, protected a foot, carried an infant, cleaned a household surface, or absorbed menstrual blood. Archaeology rarely provides a label explaining which. The absence of an identifiable menstrual pad is therefore not evidence that women had no method. It means the object belonged to a category of material and activity that the archaeological record preserves badly. The safest answer is not a single invention, but a range of practical possibilities. A woman could fold soft cloth and place it against the body. She could use absorbent plant material wrapped inside fabric or hide. She could arrange layers of clothing to reduce visible staining. She could wash reusable material when water, privacy, and time were available. In some settings, she may have allowed some blood to flow into a garment rather than trying to capture all of it. These are plausible reconstructions because people used cloth, fibers, hides, and absorbent materials for many ordinary purposes, including cleaning and wound care. But plausible does not mean proven. We do not possess a preserved Stone Age package marked first period supplies. We cannot confidently assign moss to one region, papyrus to another, and wool to a third as if ancient cultures followed a documented product catalog. The honest answer remains flexible because ancient circumstances were flexible. Whatever material she used, keeping it in place created another problem. Modern underwear is shaped to hold a pad close to the body, but ancient clothing varied enormously. A girl might wear a wrapped skirt, a tunic, a loincloth, layered robes, or a garment secured by cords and belts. A folded absorbent could be held by pressure from clothing, tied with a strip of fabric, attached to a belt, or replaced whenever it shifted or became saturated. Movement would matter. Walking long distances, grinding grain, lifting water jars, tending animals, working in fields, or carrying a child could make leakage more likely. So could the amount of bleeding. A solution that worked while resting indoors might fail during hours of physical labor. Period management was not simply a question of knowing which material absorbed blood. It depended on clothing design, mobility, access to replacements, and whether a girl had any freedom to pause. Wealth could transform the experience. A girl in an affluent household might have several garments, servants who carried water, a private place to wash, and enough spare cloth to replace a stained layer. A poorer girl might own very little fabric and work every day regardless of discomfort. In a dry region, water itself could be expensive or distant. In a crowded household, washing blood from cloth without attracting attention might be difficult. Cold weather would make drying slow. Heavy labor would make securing an absorbent harder. A woman who could remain inside had different options from one who had to walk to fields or markets. This is why the question, "What did ancient women use?" can be misleading. Two women living in the same city might manage menstruation differently because one had privacy, clothing, water, and assistance, while the other had almost none. Social class could matter as much as century or civilization. A first period could also change more than clothing. In many societies documented by anthropologists, menarche marks a transition in social identity. The girl may be instructed by older women, bathed, dressed differently, given particular foods, temporarily secluded, introduced to new responsibilities, or publicly recognized as entering womanhood. Some ceremonies emphasize belonging and collective identity. Others impose restrictions or warnings, especially concerning sexuality, fertility, marriage, or acceptable behavior. Seclusion may be experienced as exclusion in one culture and as protection, rest, instruction, or a women-controlled space in another. These examples show how varied the meaning of first menstruation can be. They also offer a possible model for the kinds of social responses ancient communities might have created. But they are comparisons, not time machines. A ceremony recorded in a recent community cannot be copied backward thousands of years and presented as a prehistoric fact. The limitation is important because traditional societies are sometimes treated as living fossils, as though their customs have remained unchanged since the Stone Age. Real cultures are not frozen. They trade, migrate, experience conquest, adopt religions, respond to governments, and reinterpret their own traditions. An anthropologist observing a menarche ceremony in the 20th or 21st century is documenting that community at that moment, not directly observing the distant human past. Still, comparison has value when used carefully. It demonstrates that menstruation does not automatically become an unspoken private secret. Communities can surround it with teaching, ritual, celebration, fear, obligation, or a mixture of all five. It makes one conclusion especially reasonable. An ancient girl's first period was probably interpreted through local knowledge. She did not experience biology in isolation. She experienced biology inside a culture that told her what the blood meant and what she was expected to do next. Written evidence begins to sharpen the picture, although not in the way we might hope. In ancient Egypt, a manuscript commonly called the Kahun gynecological papyrus was produced during the Middle Kingdom, roughly 4,000 years ago. It contains examinations, diagnoses, and treatments connected with women's reproductive health. Its ideas about the body are very different from modern medicine, but the manuscript proves that conditions associated with fertility, pregnancy, and the womb were considered worthy of systematic attention. It was not a casual scrap. The surviving papyrus appears to have been heavily used and even repaired, yet it does not give us a clear step-by-step account of how an ordinary girl managed her first menstrual bleeding. It preserves specialist medical knowledge more readily than everyday domestic practice. The closer we move toward written history, the more we hear the voice of medicine but not necessarily the voice of the girl washing her clothes. This difference explains why famous claims about Egyptian menstrual products require caution. Many modern accounts state that Egyptian women made tampons from softened papyrus. The idea sounds plausible. Papyrus was abundant, versatile, and strongly associated with ancient Egypt. Repetition then makes the claim feel established. One website cites another, an infographic simplifies the sentence, and eventually a possibility becomes a confident fact. But strong, direct evidence for papyrus being used specifically as a menstrual tampon is difficult to find. Ancient medical texts do describe materials inserted into the vagina for treatments, contraception, or delivering substances. That is not automatically evidence of an everyday menstrual product. A medical pessary and a tampon are not the same object merely because both are inserted. The papyrus story therefore teaches us something valuable. Even if the product itself remains uncertain, attractive historical details can travel much farther than the evidence supporting them. Ancient Greek medical writing gives us more detail about how some educated men interpreted menstruation. Writers associated with the Hippocratic tradition viewed the female body through theories of fluids, balance, heat, and physical constitution. In some texts, women were imagined as having flesh that absorbed more fluid, making regular bleeding necessary to remove an accumulation from the body. If menstrual blood failed to appear, physicians might fear that it would cause illness or move somewhere harmful. These theories were wrong by modern standards, but they were attempts to build a coherent biological system from observation, inherited assumptions, and limited anatomical knowledge. They also remind us that menstruation was not always ignored. Medical writers discussed its timing, quantity, absence, and relationship to health. Yet their attention focused on what menstruation meant inside a theory of the body. They still tell us surprisingly little about the folded material a working woman may have used during an ordinary day. Another myth appears in stories about ancient Greece, the claim that women wrapped wool or lint around a piece of wood and used it as a menstrual tampon. The image is memorable, uncomfortable, and repeated constantly. But historians who have traced it have found no convincing ancient evidence that this was a menstrual practice. Greek medical texts do mention wool being inserted into the vagina to apply medicines. Removing the medical context turns that treatment into a commercial-style tampon thousands of years before such a product is documented. This does not mean ancient women never used internal absorbents. It means we cannot prove this particular device from the surviving evidence. The distinction may sound small, but it changes the integrity of the entire story. Good history is not a competition to identify the strangest object. It is the discipline of separating what a source actually says from what later storytellers want it to say. By the early Roman imperial period, Soranus of Ephesus produced one of antiquity's most extensive surviving works on gynecology. His four-part treatise discussed subjects, including reproductive anatomy, pregnancy, childbirth, infant care, and the qualities expected of a midwife. Soranus sometimes rejected ideas accepted by other ancient physicians and emphasized observation and the condition of the individual patient. His work shows that women's reproductive health could be examined in remarkable detail within learned medicine. It also reveals who appears most clearly in the record: the physician, the medical author, the trained midwife, and the patient described through their categories. The ordinary transfer of menstrual knowledge from one woman to another remains mostly offstage. A grandmother demonstrating how to fold cloth did not produce a manuscript. A sister helping wash a stained garment did not commission a monument. Their expertise could be essential and still leave almost no permanent trace. Ancient attitudes toward menstrual blood were equally varied. Some communities treated it as ritually dangerous or polluting. Others connected it with fertility, transformation, protection, or unusual power. Restrictions could keep menstruating women away from religious spaces, food preparation, sexual contact, household objects, or particular forms of work, but the same visible rule could carry different meanings. Separation might communicate shame and exclusion. It might also create rest, privacy, or a space controlled by women. A first period could bring pride, anxiety, status, new clothing, new duties, warnings about pregnancy, or pressure toward marriage. There was no single ancient attitude shared by every religion and society. Even within one culture, official rules and private experiences could conflict. The girl herself might interpret a ritual differently from the elders conducting it. To reduce all ancient menstruation to the word unclean would replace a complicated history with a convenient stereotype. Ancient and pre-industrial women may also have experienced a different number of menstrual cycles across their lives, but dramatic universal totals should be avoided. Pregnancy stops menstruation for a time. Breastfeeding can delay its return, although the effect varies. Poor nutrition, illness, intense physical demands, and low energy availability can disrupt cycling. In communities where women experienced repeated pregnancies and prolonged breastfeeding, some would menstruate less often than many modern women do. But not every woman married young, became pregnant repeatedly, survived childbirth, breastfed for the same duration, or lived under identical nutritional conditions. Infertility, miscarriage, disease, social status, and personal circumstances all altered the pattern. There was no single ancient female life cycle. What can be said safely is that menstrual frequency emerged from the entire structure of life: food supply, labor, health, reproduction, infant feeding, and survival, not simply from the absence of modern products. Clearer evidence for reusable cloth appears in later historical periods, and cloth was probably one of humanity's most persistent solutions. Before mass-produced menstrual products, many women folded pieces of fabric, secured them with clothing, pins, ties, or belts, then washed and reused them. Commercial pads began changing the system only around the turn of the 20th century, and widely marketed disposable pads became successful in the 1920s. Tampons and menstrual cups entered the commercial market in the 1930s. In the scale of human history, standardized menstrual products are extremely recent. For nearly all earlier generations, management depended on materials already present in the household, practical experimentation, and knowledge passed from person to person. The industrial product did not invent menstrual care. It packaged, standardized, advertised, and sold solutions for a biological need that women had already been managing under far more varied conditions for thousands of years. Return to the girl who saw blood on her clothing. What happened next? Perhaps she went directly to an older woman. Perhaps a folded piece of cloth had already been prepared. Perhaps she used plant fiber, soft leather, layered fabric, or nothing more than the garments she was wearing. She may have been bathed, instructed, celebrated, restricted, reassured, or told to continue working. Every one of these possibilities occurred somewhere in human history. None can be assigned confidently to every ancient girl. The strongest reconstruction is not a specific product. It is a relationship. Someone who had bled before probably showed her how their community handled it. The materials were local. The rules were cultural. The knowledge was practical and often oral. What disappeared was not necessarily the care itself, but the evidence of care. History preserved the papyrus of the physician and lost the cloth held in a mother's hand. That silence is not empty. It tells us whose knowledge the past was built to remember.